Hi everybody, welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name is John Sinclair and my co-host Mark Pellavestra.
Hi John, today we've got David Wynn, the Director of EV 101, and David covers off all things EV. We talk about the EV roadmap, what constitutes a good roadmap, learnings from countries that have had a successful rollout of an EV roadmap, government incentives and disincentives, and also myths around battery technology and charging infrastructure.
Yeah, it's a really great listen because David takes away some of those concerns that we all have about owning an EV. Talks about having good education for us to get a better understanding of what is required and that we don't need to have any concerns about owning an EV. So let's jump into it.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube, iTunes and Spotify. Ring the bell below so you get notified of new updates and visit our website on autocurrents.com.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Modera is a cloud-based, AI-powered CRM and retail platform aimed at digitizing the physical process of selling a car. The Modera platform sits between existing automotive dealer and OEM systems, providing car dealerships a quick and easy shift to digital ways of working, all done entirely digitally and with total ease.
David, thanks very much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show. Maybe just to kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about what's a good roadmap for an EV rollout?
Yeah, good question, John. And Mark, thanks for having us on the show. It's quite exciting to talk about something that's a bit more of my passion right now, and certainly an area that I'm looking forward to seeing growth within Australia. Probably before I start with the roadmap, just one thing, I suppose, from an EV point of view, why are we doing it? What's really happening in regards to why have EVs? And I think something that's probably been on board now with the climate change conference that's just happened over in Glasgow, there's pretty much an event where we need to think about our climate, exactly that. And EVs is basically one of those areas where we actually are heading down the track to improve the greenhouse gases that we actually emit in Australia and, of course, across the world. Basically, around 20% of Australia's emissions really comes from transport. And obviously, that's an easy fix if we can actually take those particular areas where we know we can improve, a la EVs, and obviously then implement changes to really get into it. So for me, the roadmap itself really comes down to government. Government basically has to really provide us with emission targets. Have they given us emission targets right now? Our federal government hasn't. But certainly that's something has to be done in regards to providing us with a goal. Everyone who looks at any sort of way of moving forward has to have a target to reach. And I think most of the European countries certainly have had those targets, certainly the US, and most developed countries have too. I think a structured infrastructure for basically rolling out the smart grids, the power stations that basically provide us with the energy to charge up the batteries within the EV side of it. And it's not just passenger vehicles. We're talking about commercial vehicles. We're talking about other movement, e-mobility sort of items as well too. Setting standards. We have to make sure that we're talking about standards in plugs, standards in chargers, standards in cars. They have to be all part of the complete package that the government actually would provide us with as a good bit of a goal. And that has to really come from, I think anyway, the federal government. Certainly states have their own ways of doing things, and we found that out with the COVID. Everyone's going in different directions. But I think if we have a joint effort, a combined effort, it certainly makes it easier.
So David, just in terms of those standards, should we be complying to certain world standards, or is this necessarily just Australian standards that you're talking about?
I think it's a global sort of has to be done. You look at I'll just give you an example of the plugs, the charging plugs that you go into the cars. You have so many different plugs already, and we're only a new industry. EV is just a new industry. So standards are really important to basically make sure that they conform. I'm sure all of us have travelled throughout the globe. How many times have you actually had to have an adapter for your phone, for your computer, for anything electrical? It's just crazy. Something that's a new technology like this, I think as a global standard, certainly has to be compliant. And the good thing about it, basically, EV's up and running in Europe, very big. US is starting off quite nicely, obviously with a couple of different areas where you've got Tesla doing one thing, and of course you've got the Europeans doing the others, and you've got the American side of it, the manufacturing side of it doing another. They have to be really controlled. And I think now I'm seeing and reading more about that sort of collaboration is starting to happen. So for Australia, it's probably pretty easy. And this is one of the areas that we started talking about when I first started with EVs in 2008 with Nissan and Renault, and of course the other manufacturers in Australia. We started talking about these really important elements. So we basically now have the ability to ensure that those global standards are enforced in Australia. We have some very good committees already taken place. We've got some good operations now with everybody trying to collaborate. It's certainly, there's still got to be a framework from a federal point of view to make sure that those standards are adhered to.
Pardon my ignorance. I've sort of been out of the EV loop for a while, and I know when you and I worked at a brand that was big on EV, back then there were actually two different plugs, but there's actually more because the Tesla plug's different to the Type 1 and Type 2 chargers that the other brands use. Is that correct? So is there 3 or 4 different types of plugs?
Well, globally there's a good half a dozen, and basically what they're trying to do is the two elements. You've got the AC charging, and you've got the DC charging. And the DC charging basically is a standard plug. The standard plugs basically look at having the abilities to all the charging stations fit your operations. Tesla over in Europe are now developing a plug basically to comply with the European standards. And that's going to happen throughout the globe.
So what is the European standard? Because I suppose that's the question. Because I'm thinking it's like VHS and the old days of video. You had beta and you had VHS. Which technology is the one that ended up being the one that it's VHS? So which way are we going to go with plugs? Is Tesla going to win, or is it going to be where everybody else is going?
Tesla will basically try to keep their own type of plug, but in Europe now they've actually made ECU laws basically saying that if you have a charging system, you have to open it up to the rest of the cars within that within that country. Those laws will come in place pretty well next year. And then what's happening now, Tesla have actually made adapter plugs for their charging systems that will be then applicable for the other manufacturers to be utilised within their charging operations. Because don't forget, Tesla probably has the biggest and largest charging infrastructure across the globe, and it's well established. So they won't be taking anything out other than putting adapters in. So other manufacturers or other owners of other manufacturers' product can actually charge in their charging system.
So is the Tesla system DC or AC? Which is the dominant? So they're DC?
All the fast chargers, basically what they call rapid chargers, which is 50 kilowatt hours up to now 300, and they're going to go further, are all DC chargers. So the DC chargers, just fast rapid chargers. For a majority of people actually having the product now and charging at home will always be doing AC charging. And even Tesla has AC chargers as well at home. And those plugs are basically standardised. So,
for example, the Leafs and the IMEVs and all those cars, the original EVs, would have been AC?
Yeah, well, there was no such thing as a rapid charger when the Leaf came out, the IMEV came out, and the Fluence come out. Basically, it was all AC charging.
David, do you think we need to get the similar type of legislation as we've got in Europe, in Australia, that's saying all the vehicles need to be charged through one charging type of plug?
Well, the charging plug is interesting because basically what you'll have is in the car, you'll have a mechanism in place where you'll have a AC and DC configuration. And the DC side of it is basically allows the fast charging for any of the European cars that come through into the country, and also the Japanese and the Chinese and the US products coming into the country. They're going to be basically all the same within the boundaries of what we actually have right now. Because of Tesla now basically having to change their structure, they'll actually have different charges. So
Because I think that's a really important point, because most people would not know. To the average person, they wouldn't know that there's actually a difference. They just think EV. But this is actually a big stumbling block if we don't get it right.
Well, you can't pull in right now to any Tesla operation, any charge point globally, right as we speak, and charge your VW, your Porsche, your Audi. You can't do it yet, but it will happen. That's where regulations come into it. And that's where governments have, and that's what's happening over in Europe. Basically, they've said, no, we're not taking this anymore. We actually want a combined unit where everybody be able to charge from any charger, basically, that we actually have on offer in our country. Because the other part of the policy was basically the incentives. And that's where Australia really is a mess right now. And I call that as a mess because what we have is the federal government really not offering anything basically other than providing a incentive for people to manufacture or build charging systems, infrastructure charging systems throughout the country. Then each state has their own incentive. So it's really interesting to see that we have this fragmented approach to this whole industry, and every state basically has provided their own roadmap. Instead of having a federal approach and having it very fine-tuned for their specific needs for each state, we've got this basically 5 states and 2 territories doing their own thing.
And David, so what would be some examples of successful rollouts of our EV roadmap? Can you give us some examples globally?
Yeah, look, I suppose if you go to the Norwegian one, Norwegian success has been amazing. They actually haven't put anything in place in regards to a time frame other than saying that by 2025, they wanted as many EVs on the road as possible. Right now, as we speak, it's up to 90% EVs in their sales. They will say that they will get to 95, if not a high 90s anyway, by April next year, which is quite amazing, considering they hadn't legislated any sort of dates regarding to the mandating of EVs and obviously the phasing out of ICE engines. And if you look at what they've done, basically, they removed all the taxes associated with purchasing an EV. They basically had their VAT, which is our GST. There was no charge for that, so remove that 25% straight away. There's no annual road tax, so therefore registrations is free of charge. And they will be phased in at a later stage. But to get the early adopters, I would call it, get them involved in regards to ensuring that they got behind the EV, they removed the road tax or the registration. They did things like reduce tolls on ferries, reducing tolls on their tollways, basically providing with free council parking. Company cars, we have FBT here. They reduced the 50% of the company car taxes if you had an EV. So they kept on incentivising people financially, and to the point where they did a study in regards to a cost with a Golf VW. It was at 34,000 euros, around about 34,000 euros as a normal ICE engine. And then they removed all those costs associated with purchasing and operating, the first year of operating. And that operating cost and purchase cost came to 33,000 for an e-Golf as an equivalent type of thing. So basically, they really incentivize people to start using, if they're buying a new car, using EVs rather than an internal combustion engine. And of course, they put all those things in place like the infrastructure, incentives, the policies in the early, basically 2000s. So all those planning requirements, issues were all put in place to ramp up, knowing that basically there's only 1 or 2 manufacturers at that stage producing EVs. So it's pretty important that they actually planned that out. And that's where, where from an Australian point of view, or even from any country that hasn't adopted EV, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can follow the people who've actually been successful with it, providing you actually have everything in place and you plan that roadmap out quite nicely.
So Dave, just getting an understanding. So in Norway, so we talked about a good roadmap. So did the government pay for the infrastructure to be built, like the charging network? Is that how it worked?
They subsidise companies. Absolutely. They helped basically roll out that roadmap. Not only that, they also looked at the grid requirements as well too. So they helped basically plan out the grid requirements for it. Basically is saying that if we had 80% take-up, or if they had 80% take-up of EVs in their country, that would basically only increase their grid requirements by 10 to 15%. I was listening to Tom Elliott on 3AW. The world's going to come to an end if everyone plugs their car charger in at the same time. That doesn't happen. We've got to think about how these things work. You don't see everybody filling a car up at the petrol station altogether. It just happens at different times in regards to the usage of an EV power or charging. It's basically equivalent to a normal residential house once a week. So when you charge it, 75 to 85 kilowatt battery, you're charging it the same what you use 15 kilowatts per day for a house. You don't charge it all together at 7 o'clock at night, or you don't charge it together at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They're all different times. So for you and I, we'd be charging, obviously, at a time which suits us. We would be travelling average of 40 Ks a day for a week. It might be different days, different times, so forth. So the grid sort of requirements aren't as great as what people think. And with that situation in place, as long as you actually then start looking at what's required as you do a slow ramp up, that's what doing a slow ramp up from what we're looking at right now. We have 1 million cars that we sell each year in Australia. We're not going to sell 1 million cars, EVs, from day dot. It's going to be a slow ramp up to 2030 and on beyond that. So, you can plan those things out if you need to be. And of course, you look at the population areas where it's going to happen first too. Those areas are really important. And that was a planning. Norway's a bit different to Australia, obviously a bit smaller, but same token, the planning is part of it. So the grid is something that certainly has to be looked at. You have microgrids, and then down the track, we'll have vehicle to the grid itself. So we can actually use the battery in the car to actually help charge these peak times as well. You can nominate a percentage in the car to basically go down to utilise for the usage if things do get to the point where the supply is greater than what we can produce. So they're the kind of things down the track that will iron out, but certainly it's not the doomsday that a lot of people think. And of course, the other element too is that renewables are growing in Australia too. It's a perfect country. We've got so much sunshine. Yes, it is nighttime as well, but sunshine during the day, and you have batteries. We are going to have the biggest battery plant in the world coming in the Hunter Valley next year being built. And those infrastructure can be built reasonably quickly in comparison to, say, a coal station, a nuclear station, whatever. You can build those quite rapidly. So yes, during the day you have the sun, and during the night you have the batteries. It's going to happen. It's going to work out quite well as long as it's planned correctly.
Now, David, you've been covering off a lot of infrastructure, and that really seems to be, and we're hearing a lot in the press, that infrastructure is where it's at to start with, because the manufacturers are making the cars. They're coming like it or not. The challenge is going to be, how do you charge it up? So can you please tell us about the charging infrastructure and what we need in Australia?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a lot of people have been talking about it, and especially the individuals that really want to be scaremongering, would say, in regards to our particular situation, knowing that we've actually had blackouts throughout the last, say, decade. And obviously with the summers that we have, we need to really look at and make sure that we're all okay moving forward. I suppose for me, the elephant in the room is that, in Australia, we have coal stations. We have 23 coal stations. But certainly our usage of coal and our renewable energy, coal's going down, renewable energy is going up. We have hydro, we have the wind, and we have solar. And again, we spoke about the last month, there was over 4 days, which is 60% of the energy usage was based off renewables, which was substantial. And we haven't really got any battery power charging, you could say, to actually then store it for overnight or whatever peak periods, but that's coming on board. So I think for me, basically, when you look at the renewables, we started at 2002% of renewables. Now we're up to just roughly over or on 30%. That's growing at a rapid rate. In fact, we've got probably the biggest growth rate of solar or renewables in the globe right now, which is exciting. We've also got 1 in 4 houses having solar panels on our roofs. Some of which have batteries within their operations as well, some won't. But for argument's sake, I've got an 8 kilowatt solar system. I get around about 50 kilowatts per day with that. So I then give back to the grid for a minimal amount, unfortunately now. I could be using that just for charging my car during the day if it was at home, say for the weekend or whatever, or if I wasn't at work. There will be opportunities where people with solar will have that chance to have free power without a problem at all. But then basically you look at the side of it where we really need to grow our infrastructure. Yes, we are coal-based. The systems will have to change where we can, or will change, because our vehicle-to-grid technology will start improving. So as we get basically a good number of vehicles on the road and they're hooked up to the chargers, again, mentioned before, where we can see if you wanted to have 10% of your battery being given to the grid during those peak time, you can nominate that. And that's the smart grid situation, which will basically come on board as the technology comes to Australia, and that's been worked on as we speak too. So their ability is a two-way intersection, you could say, with a two-way grid that communicates, just not one way, as we have currently right now. Over the world, there's 1 million charging stations right now as we speak. In Australia, we have just on 3,000, and around about 50 of them are fast chargers. It is a big country. We are different to anywhere else in the world. So it is a substantial job that we have to do. But if we look at it in three different ways, so residential, commercial, and then the third part of it is travelling in the country. So from a residential point of view, and everyone thinks that what happens if I do my 400, 500 kilometres? What happens if we stop going out with our families? Well, you do that, but you do it so irregularly. It's not an issue to the point where you have to be concerned about your own day-to-day activities in your EV unless you're doing that on a regular basis. So as I said to you, most of the time, 80% of the time you'll be charging at home. So that's fixed, not a problem there. Sometimes you'll be using your own solar panels. So again, not a problem there. It's when you do actually use the charging from the grid that you've got to think and make sure that the system's up and running properly. Commercial, and this is where the biggest problem I think we lie right now in regards to the commercial part of it. And I'm talking about two elements here. I'm talking about buildings, so apartments. So all of a sudden you have 10 cars come into your apartment that actually requires a charger. How do you actually put the infrastructure up? Then you have hospitality, accommodation. People want to put their chargers on there. How do you actually cater for that? And the good news is we've got some really great and clever companies in Australia. You know, companies like Jet Charge, we have EV, SE, and so on, where basically they have their own platforms where you can be basically modulating your charging to multiple different chargers. So you have 10 vehicles in there. Some have fully charged, some are half charged, some are all charged. They can actually modulate the actual charging to each of those individual vehicles without creating too much of a spike in the power board within the operation. But right now, you know, those things haven't been thought about to a point where you go into a majority of the apartments right now, it's not even a consideration. So that's something that's got to be thought about, but it's a great business to be looking into for sure. Then the other aspect, what happens if you're a rep, you're out on the road in Metro Melbourne, you do you 400 kilometres a day, perhaps, might do 300 kilometres a day. There's not too many public fast chargers in Metro Melbourne. And I'll talk about fast charge. You will have, if with a 50 kilowatt, an hour, you'll get half a charge. So it may be then another 250 K, but that's an hour. If you're 100, that means you obviously get to peak almost full within that hour. There's not too many of those charging stations around in Melbourne or in Sydney or in Brisbane right now as we speak. So that's got to change as well. And then if you went to the country, so you did your country drive. Now, my first EV drive was from Sydney to Melbourne, and it was fantastic. There were ultra fast chargers right through, and most of the manufacturers now have your charging locations part of your navigation system, and it's also plugged in from your requirement in regards to how much is left in the tank in regards to your charging and your travelling distance, your range distance, and range anxiety, you know, whether people like or not, they're still there, but this alleviates that situation, especially when you have a structure or infrastructure in place. The last drive that I did coming down, we pushed it to the point where it had 3% left in the battery. I could have stopped at Albury, but I wanted to try to push the point and see how accurate it was. And I stopped at Euroa. Got the picture of the battery station and, of course, the dash saying 3%. So if you have the infrastructure there, and it's a quick infrastructure a quick charger where you can actually make sure that you can charge up within a reasonable time. In this particular case, it's 20 minutes. So from 0 to 80%, it took 20 minutes. The vehicle was capable enough to do that too, because not all cars are capable of doing that. Then only on the main routes. So if you're going up to Bendigo, if you're going up to Mildura, those rapid chargers aren't there yet. And they're the kind of things that the infrastructure has to really be quick and ensure that they're actually in place before we actually do have a true transition from ICE vehicles to EVs. Don't forget, we only probably had a handful of vehicles that we could actually use with EVs in general, EVs that were 100% battery electric vehicles. We have 19 at the end of this year. We'll have another 24 at the end of 2022. Things are changing quite quickly. And obviously, we're going to have a lot of cars on the roads.
I just think it's interesting, the charging infrastructure really seems to be, if I'm hearing what you're saying, David, that the charging infrastructure and the incentives are the key, because the manufacturers are bringing the cars, they're coming. So the cars are coming. There just needs to be a reason why I should buy the car. And we've actually got to take away the objections to buy the car. So the one objection is I drive to Sydney every second week, so therefore I need charging infrastructure along the Hume Highway. But so if that infrastructure is there, but the reality is, and I think it's interesting you talk about, there's 80% of the cars will actually be charged at home. So you really don't need those other infrastructure points, because you'll be charging at your home, or if you go somewhere for a vacation, you're staying in a hotel, the hotels will have infrastructure. So that's where you'll have the opportunity to charge your vehicle. The key is the standardisation of the plug. So as long as it's not like an Apple plug versus an Android plug and all this sort of stuff, that you can roll up and you can plug in to a device that's going to top you up with electricity, but given 80% of your time is going to be filled up at home anyway. So really the fear of the infrastructure is that it's there in case I need it, but the reality is it's probably like a public toilet. It's nice to know it's there, but I'm not going to use it unless I really have to. Is that a fair analogy?
It's exactly the way that people have a concern with the EV side of it, without realising really that, yes, 80% of the time you'll be charging it at home, if not even more, to be honest. But, in reality, that there will be times when you do travel, obviously past the distance. So for argument's sake, if I went to Phillip Island from here, from Lower Templestowe, I'd get home without a problem with most EVs right now. Not all, but most EVs. So the ones that you don't get home with, that's what you actually need to think about in regards to saying, okay, where is the next charging station? They are coming around, but certainly that is the biggest concern. If you have majority of the newer cars that are hitting the market now, so the Kias, the Hyundais, the Porsches, the Audis, the BMWs and so forth, not an issue at all. And that they're going to make that round trip without a problem. It's earlier products that certainly you do have that issue, but those earlier products are normally second cars anyway. Down the track, they will become your primary car, the EVs, because you will have your distances now. Teslas can get over their 400 kilometre mark without a problem at all. The Australian Renewable Energy have just issued their first round, you could say, of funding, just on $24 million worth of funding for 5 companies to roll out a federal part of the infrastructure. So Ampol, basically, $7 million. It'll have, I think they said, 121 chargers that'd be put throughout 3 states. ChargeFox at 1.4 million. They're basically rolling out, as a federal side of it, a number of specific areas, specific locations where people will need charging, and that's also in metro areas too. And then you have each state. If you look at WA, WA is going to have the longest charging infrastructure in the world. A charger within 200 kilometres of each other, getting from A to B. So you'll be able to have a fast charger. I think they're 50 kilowatt chargers, not 100 kilowatt chargers, around 45 locations. You look at Queensland, same thing. They've got basically from top to bottom. All the states are also putting in their dollars and cents to obviously facilitate the infrastructure side of it. In New South Wales, they're putting over 1,000 chargers within the rural, provincial and metro areas themselves as well too. Time frame is going to be the critical thing, and obviously they'll pick their volume areas, their population areas first. New South Wales is really interesting. They've got now an interactive map, so you can actually go into this map and look at the population, the time frame for vehicles to be, I suppose, introduced, their prediction for EVs, then the charging side of it, whether how many through each year, basically up to 2030.
David, your home charger, what does that consist of, and how much would that set you back for just to set up a charger at home?
The charger, actually what it is, it's just basically a connection point. So it connects to your car. The plug actually has like a handshake to the system. It says, yes, you're legally okay. I've got all the system. I can talk to you, and I'll start charging it when you want me to start charging it. Cost-wise, basically you have a one-phase 7.5 kilowatt or kilowatt system put through the program. Is probably around about between $600 to $1,200, depending on what sort of technology you want with it. If you want it to be just a complete charger, without any smart parts of it, no communication, just a in-out handshake, cheap, but up to $1,400, $1,500. Some councils are actually also providing subsidies to actually fit those particular charges in your house as well too.
So, David, what's going to make the early majority? So you talk about early adopters. Early adopters embrace new technology. They spend more. They're usually high net worth individuals and they're risk takers. Whereas the early majority of the population, where most of the people are still hesitant. What's going to make it or take away that hesitancy to jump from the early adopters across that quantum leap into where the early majority live?
It's really basically not being fearful of they're going to be left stranded somewhere. And obviously that means good communication package. So the car manufacturers and the governments really have to push the point where it's not as bad as what people think. And you look at the situation where you have people still on mainstream radio now, saying that the whole world, well, not the whole world, will come to a blackout situation if we all plug our cars in together. We've got to educate people, and educating people meaning that basically you have the right information. So the frequently asked questions really need to be there for people to see. Everything basically has to be in simple language. Don't try to confuse it too much. Make sure that you've got questions that are probably at the concern with concerns with people in general, easily and accessible. I've got my website. Certainly I try to make sure that the information there is to the normal person, basically to make sure that they understand how good the EV experience is. Of course, if you have your solar panels on your roof and your battery in your garage, you could basically be running, from a operational point of view, for next to nothing in regards to the running costs of it. The other side to EVs is the fact that your maintenance costs are reduced. So I think what we need to do is make sure that people are well educated and understood that the fears that they have right now, and that being the infrastructure, that I'm running out of range, therefore where can I get my car charged, may never happen if they're structured in a way where they understand that what they have to do. Get used to those kind of things. When you pull up to your house, you put your charger in your car, basically that's the first thing you do before you then go into your front door. It becomes just a natural thing. And the good thing about it, you can't take off with the charger in the car. It won't allow you to move forward.
Now, David, in terms of incentives, you've spoken quite a bit about the different types of incentives. What do you think should be the one or two incentives that the government should focus on at this stage to really get things moving forward in Australia?
If you follow a bit of the Norwegian way, for me, you got luxury tax in the federal side of it. That should be abolished. I mean, luxury tax was here basically for the saviour of the local manufacturers. That should be abolished for every EV, no matter how much it costs. I personally believe that you should be free registration. If we're really serious about global warming, if we're really serious about that situation where it may not affect us, but it certainly will affect our kids and their kids down the track. If the government is really serious about that, as we all should be, they're the kind of things that financial assistance should be part and parcel, because they can do that straight away. Tolls, if you're on a toll road, no tolls. They're the running costs that you basically will entice people, yes, to pay the extra dollars first up to get the car. But all those elements should be looked at as an incentive for early adopters. And then you phase those out. Now we're looking at Victoria and South Australia implementing a kilometre tax, EVs only. So again, if you look at the big picture, do we have to start looking at having red show and having these elements as a ICE and EV separate? Let's put it into one basket. Let's do it right now. And let's start looking at ways that we actually can start incorporating not an extra tax on one type of car and less tax on another. Let's look at having it as a combined thing. So I think we should be looking at structures as well to what we do, paying for registration, stamp duty, and all those kind of things as part of the complete program. We know as ICE vehicles slow up, obviously the taxes for fuel is going to be reducing. So they're going to have to get their money somehow. But at the same token, you should be thinking of those things now and not hiding it. There's got to be a balance. And right now, there's got to be an incentive for people to fork out more money for new technology, for new ways of doing things, to benefit the globe. And I suppose that's our main goal, is to reduce global warming. And then if you really want to look at something else, incentivising people not to buy an ICE vehicle too, you can start putting taxes on emissions from a ICE vehicle as well too. The bigger the car, the more pollution it has, the more greenhouse gases it produces. You can actually start increasing that. So if there's swings and roundabouts, you want people to stop buying ICE vehicles, you can do that as well.
Now, Dave, we talked about batteries. So if infrastructure is something that keeps me up at night if I'm driving an EV, the reason why it would be keeping me up is because of the battery technology, that this battery is not going to give me the range. So if I think of the range of the vehicle, the electric motors are electric motors. They're very reliable. It takes a lot to burn out an electric motor. The real key here with the EV is the battery. It's the elephant in the room. So tell us about battery technology, because we hear so much about it. And what's the current state of technology and where do we go? Like, what are the batteries?
We've got to a point where we've mastered the basic lithium-ion battery. It has some fairly interesting chemistry in it. You have the situation where you have the anode and the cathode basically having different elements to it. If you look at the anode with the graphite's plentiful, that will soon go into, they say, silicon down the track, 2028, 2030. But the real challenge will be I think the change in the chemistry for the cathodes themselves. And I think the current one now, which is used widely, they call it the NMC, which is the lithium nickel cobalt something oxide. That basically is probably the one where those particular minerals are the hardest to get, and probably, again, you're looking at the environment side of it, probably not as environmentally friendly in their mining process. So we've got to make sure that basically those elements are looked at when we're producing the battery, and then we look at different technologies. So different technology, lithium-ion phosphate is the next sort of technology coming out. It's been used in the lower price cars, starting to be right now, because it is cheaper to manufacture, but it also hasn't got those particular minerals there where you have problems where you have mining issues. The area where you look at the improvement of the batteries actually right now is probably pretty good. Now, all the batteries now are basically within most of the modern cars are cooled and control cooled. So for the Taycan, for argument's sake, you pull up to a charging station, you actually precondition your batteries from a temperature point of view. You actually have a system where actually you can program it to be a temperature, pull up, and it will A, look after the battery, but B, basically provide a good charging rate, because when you charge, obviously, batteries, they get warm, and that's when you obviously start having degradation and so forth. And I suppose down the track, the holy grail will be the solid state battery, but then the charging rate will be 10 minutes, 5 minutes and so forth, and very limited degradation whatsoever, and longer cycles. This is another thing where people get mixed up. I'm going to have to replace a battery after 10 years, 8 years, whatever. And I think the rate that people now look at is around 1% or 2% a year degradation, and it's not happening.
It's funny you mentioned that, Dave, because I recall back when we were in the early days of EV in the early 2010s, 11s and all this sort of stuff. The talk was, the battery's gone after 7 years, throw the car away. And we had a podcast, John, if you recall, with Santo, who just came back from Europe, from Eurotax glasses. And there was no evidence of this tsunami of batteries coming back, post 2008, 2009, 2010, where batteries are failing and they're piling up on the side of the road because they're being just replaced and the cars are redundant. It is amazing that we overestimated how many batteries would fail within 7 years and the cars would be worth nothing. And it was also interesting to see that residual values, the actual data, particularly in Europe, residual values on electric cars is actually quite good. And even here, it's actually not too bad. Initial ones were low because of the fear of EVs, but we're starting to see the adoption in the aftermarket and the recognition that, no, the battery doesn't actually die after 7 years and I can continue driving this car and for the purposes it's designed for.
Like every new technology, people probably feared the worst, but it hasn't come to fruition whatsoever. So for a lot of people, I think it's been a bit of a pleasant surprise. And, from right now as we speak, you look at, I suppose, the ability to change as required, it hasn't needed change. I mean, the basically chemical aspect of a battery hasn't changed that much right now. It will down the track, but certainly right now it won't. And again, something I posted only recently, there's a company in California that's taking the complete cradle out of the car and putting it as a power source for grid usage during peak periods. And their costs associated with that is $2 per kilowatt or whatever. They're charging $25 per kilowatt when it's peak period for grid usage. So the second I suppose, step of batteries coming out of a car is there as a commodity for grid. And we've all talked about that in the past too, and maybe used for your own power backs at home and so forth. And of course, down the track even further, there's even recycling side of it. And I'm talking to a company right now that basically recycling graphite from old batteries, but also mining graphite, but in a way where it's being ticked of approval from environmentally friendly. So from a recycling point of view, the materials are going to be reused. And something that Musk said many, many years ago is the fact that down the track, when there is a peak period of electric vehicles, we'll be using the components or the chemistry or the materials from those batteries to redo for new batteries. So, I mean, from a recycling point of view and a 360, batteries aren't as bad as what people are again thinking it's going to be from an environment point of view. New technology always scares people. And once you get involved with it and once you see the outcomes of some, certainly there's going to be some issues in regards to early concerns. And you did mention in one of your communications to us about fires and so forth. There's no explosions. It is a fire. Lithium just burns. It just burns quite nicely. So it's very hard to put out. But they're so few and far between compared to petrol explosions or gas explosions from a car too. So there's swings and roundabouts. And that's also one of the areas where they're going to change in regards to the lithium phosphate batteries, where they're not as highly inflammable, you could say, compared to what the current mixture of battery actually is as well too. So safety is going to be part of that side of it. Longevity, recycling is all going to be, sort of a trend you'll see with EVs and the batteries moving forward.
Dave, just one other question around the explosions and the fires. So what is it that makes lithium burn? Is it the water? Is water the issue? If water gets on a battery?
No, it's overheating and shorting out. Overheating creates a shorting out, and if there's also a problem within the wiring structure or the integrity of the unit. If you look at Bolt in the US with Chevrolet are having a massive recall. I think it's $1.9 billion, the cost of the recall. They're replacing every single battery unit in every single Bolt that's been manufactured. Early stages, and these things will happen. Recalls happen all the time. We're all in the automotive industry and we've experienced that. It's how you handle that and making sure that you actually can address it quite quickly and efficiently.
And you mentioned that there's graphite. I always think of graphite as being the problem with Chernobyl, because the difference with the nuclear reactor that was at Chernobyl versus what was used in the West, when you watch the documentary, was that they used graphite tips in the rods to modulate the reactors. And the graphite was causing the problem because it would stick and then cause the actual thing to turn into an atomic bomb. But graphite in a battery is not the same. It's a lot more stable process.
In the States, there's over 250 companies working on battery technology as we speak, giving grants from the government to private industry and so forth. So there's technologies happening everywhere. Tesla is just going to launch the 4680, which is a brand new, bigger battery. That's promising cost savings. It's promising safer materials in it. It's just going to keep on going. But the thing that people will always look at is, I just wait. Well, if you keep on waiting, you're never going to buy it because change will happen on a regular basis. The good thing is right now, as we speak, the cars are drivable right as we speak. We have no problems with a kilometre distance. So 350 to 400 kilometres is probably what the ranges you see most modern cars nowadays. Everybody can handle something of that nature without a problem. And so just park it into your garage, charge it up when you want to, and then away you go again.
All right, thanks, David. I'd like to summarise, if I may, and correct me if I've missed anything here, but as far as the EV roadmap, we talked about what is a good EV roadmap, but really it comes down to the why. We need to answer the question, why are we going down the road of EVs to start with? And it's interesting that 100 years ago, the best-selling car was an EV. So all the early cars in the US were actually electric cars, which I think is quite ironic, but the internal combustion engine won. It's the whole challenge of, obviously, CO2. And at some point, the government's going to introduce emission targets. Transport is responsible for approximately 20% of our CO2 emissions. But we need to have infrastructure, a smart grid, and the federal, state and local governments, all three need to work in unison to have a good and interconnected roadmap for us to have a successful rollout of EVs. And when you look at Norway, Norway is the benchmark. 90% of vehicle sales are EVs. They didn't actually mandate have specific mandates that put up targets of what they wanted to achieve. And then they put the incentives. So it was more carrot than stick, where there are no taxes on EVs, no tolls, and the infrastructure was rolled out so that you could actually have a quicker uptake. So early adopters and early majority actually jumped on board very quickly. And there's fringe benefits to having an EV. So then we talked about where the Australian situation is. And when we look at, there's 23 coal-powered power stations, or coal-fired power stations, but we're up to 30% renewables. And a quarter of the houses actually have solar, which means it makes sense because you said something that was really powerful, and that is 80% of EVs actually get charged at home. So if 80% of people are charging at home and there's a quarter of the houses have solar, you're actually at a significant advantage to match your car to your EV, your EV to your solar process. But then you also talked about, from a rollout perspective, the hospitality venues that you go to if you're going to go away somewhere. They're also embracing and adopting EV infrastructure. So if you're charging primarily at home, where you go to for your vacation or your break or your work, the opportunity is there to charge at that location. And in the main, most people will be able to drive to and from work or do their normal commuting without needing to charge anywhere other than home. And we use the analogy of, it's a bit like, you want to know there are public toilets out there, but you really don't want to use them. You'd rather have the comfort of your home to charge your car. So then we talked about, there's more cars coming. There's more and more models. The facts of life are all manufacturers are now well and truly down the road of introducing more EV models. And that means, A, the prices will come down, even though right now it is very much for the innovators and early adopters. But this is where the government incentives need to come into play to make the early majority attractive to the early majority. Car prices will slowly come down for EVs as the mainstream models electrify, but there will still be a premium. So government incentives need to be involved, and the government roadmap from an infrastructure needs to be involved. But we're all been scared about batteries, because we've heard about the battery fires and a lot of scaremongering that you're not going to have a long weekend, you can't tow with an EV. That's not true. The scaremongering about if we all plug in, the grid's going to die, because guess what? We all don't plug in at the same time, just like we don't all fill up at the service station at the same time unless we're panic buying. And the other thing you talked about, which was the fires. Well, yes, there have been some fires with EVs. Can't deny that. But there's actually more fires with petrol and LPG cylinders bursting into flames in collisions and having inappropriate work done on them as well. So there's a lot of fear around this unknown, this new technology. And there's the job to be done for all of us in the industry to, I suppose, debunk, because anti-EVs are probably similar to anti-vaxxers. And some people you're never going to convince. They're just going to say, I don't believe in the technology, it's not proven. I think we're on the journey. It's coming, like it or not, and it's a matter of embracing it and being ahead of the game and really understanding it and adding value to society, but also enjoying the vehicles for what they drive and how they drive. Have I missed anything, David?
I'm hoping that we can all get together, governments, federal, state, territories, obviously the car clubs and, of course, the manufacturers, and really look at how we can actually improve the environment long term, because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing it for our kids and their kids as well too. So really appreciate the time and the discussion.
David, thanks very much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Hopefully you got as much out of the discussion with David Wynn as we did. If you like what you heard, please follow us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, subscribe and ring the bell below so you get notified of new updates. Visit our website at autocurrents.com and follow us on iTunes and Spotify.
Thanks very much for listening.